Few places on Earth have mastered the art of surviving everything the world threw at them, and then quietly becoming the world's blueprint for the future. This is not just a country, this is a civilization. This physical isolation forced the Japanese to develop something rare, a culture so deeply rooted in its own identity that no invasion, no occupation, no catastrophe could erase it. But here is the paradox. Japan also understood, at critical moments, that the only way to survive the modern world was to radically transform. Not once, not twice, multiple times. You're about to watch a civilization perform the impossible, again and again. The Japanese archipelago, 4 main islands rising from the Pacific, was not always the disciplined, orderly civilization we know today. The earliest inhabitants, the Jomon people, were hunters and gatherers who lived here for over 14,000 years. They left behind some of the world's oldest pottery, not weapons, not walls, pottery. Then came the Yayoi people, migrating from the Korean peninsula around 300 BCE. They brought rice farming, metal tools, and a new social order. The mixing of Jomon and Yayoi cultures created the genetic and cultural foundation of the Japanese people we know today. Early Japanese society organized itself into clans, uji, each controlling territory and worshipping its own ancestral gods. Were not peaceful neighbors. They were rivals, warriors. The seeds of what would become the samurai class were already being planted. By 300 CE, one clan rose above the others, the Yamato. They did not just conquer, they claimed divine authority. The Yamato rulers declared themselves descendants of Amaterasu, the sun goddess. This was not merely political spin. This was the birth of an institution that would shape Japan for the next 1700 years. The imperial family, the world's longest reigning dynasty. Japan's early imperial court looked west across the sea and saw something remarkable. The Tang dynasty of China, a civilization with sophisticated writing, Buddhism, Confucian governance, and architectural grandeur. Japan did something unusual for a proud nation. It deliberately chose to learn. The imperial court sent scholars, monks, and envoys to China. They returned with Buddhism, Chinese characters, city planning models, and legal codes. But Japan never became China. It absorbed, adapted, and transformed everything it received. Chinese characters became the foundation for Japanese writing systems, hiragana and katakana. Buddhism merged with native Shinto beliefs rather than replacing them. The Japanese genius for taking something foreign and making it distinctly Japanese was already visible in the 6th century. This pattern, absorb, adapt, transform, would repeat itself throughout Japanese history. Remember it. Prince Shotoku, one of Japan's most celebrated early leaders, formalized this cultural fusion. He promoted Buddhism, created Japan's first constitution emphasizing harmony, wa, and built magnificent temples that still stand today. He was not just a ruler, he was a nation builder. In 710 CE, Japan built its first permanent capital at Nara, modeled directly on the Chinese capital of Chang'an. Grand Buddhist temples, wide avenues, government ministries. Japan was declaring to the world, we are a civilization. But true cultural flowering happened in the next capital, Heian-kyo, modern-day Kyoto. The Heian period was Japan's aristocratic golden age. The imperial court became a world unto itself, obsessed with poetry, painting, music, and the delicate art of romance. In this refined world, women wrote Japan's greatest literary masterpieces. Lady Murasaki Shikibu wrote The Tale of Genji around 1000 CE, widely considered the world's first novel. Sei Shonagon wrote The Pillow Book, a sharp, witty diary of court life. In an age when most civilizations kept women silent, Heian Japan's women were producing world literature. Meanwhile, something dangerous was happening in the provinces. While the aristocrats at court wrote poems about autumn leaves, warrior clans, the bushi, were growing powerful. They were doing the work the elegant courtiers couldn't, protecting land, enforcing order, making war. The age of beauty was about to collide with the age of the sword. 2 great warrior clans, the Taira and the Minamoto, had been gathering power for decades. In 1180, they finally went to war. The Minamoto won. Their leader, Yoritomo, did not march to Kyoto and demand the emperor's crown. He was cleverer than that. He left the emperor in place, the divine figurehead, and created an entirely new system of government in Kamakura, far from the old capital. He called himself Shogun, supreme military commander. And just like that, Japan had 2 governments. The emperor in Kyoto, who held spiritual and symbolic authority, and the shogunate in Kamakura, which held actual power. This split between symbolic emperor and real military power would define Japan for the next 700 years. The samurai were not just soldiers, they were an entire class, a philosophy. Their code, Bushido, demanded total loyalty to one's lord, absolute courage in battle, and honor above life itself. A samurai who failed his lord did not beg forgiveness. He committed seppuku, ritual suicide, death before dishonor. These were not just warriors, they were the architects of Japanese identity. But this was not the end. Something far worse was coming. In 1274, Kublai Khan, the Mongol emperor who already ruled China, Korea, and half the known world, sent a fleet of 900 ships and 40,000 soldiers to conquer Japan. The samurai met them on the beaches of Kyushu. They fought bravely, but Mongol firepower and tactics were unlike anything they had faced. And then, a storm came. A massive typhoon tore through the Mongol fleet, destroying hundreds of ships and killing thousands of soldiers. The invasion collapsed. In 1281, Khan tried again, this time with 4,500 ships and 140,000 men, the largest naval invasion in history up to that point. Again, the samurai held. Again, a massive typhoon struck and annihilated the Mongol fleet. The Japanese called these storms kamikaze, divine wind. The gods themselves had protected Japan. His belief that Japan was a sacred, protected land would echo 7 centuries later in the most tragic way imaginable. For over a century, Japan tore itself apart. The Sengoku period, the age of warring states, was Japan's darkest, most violent era. Central authority collapsed. Powerful regional lords, daimyo, fought constant wars for supremacy. Villages burned, armies clashed. The country was in perpetual civil war. 3 great warlords would eventually end this chaos, and each of them changed Japan forever. Oda Nobunaga was brutal, brilliant, and utterly ruthless. He was the first to use firearms, introduced by Portuguese traders, at scale on the battlefield. He burned Buddhist monasteries that opposed him. He was assassinated by one of his own generals in 1582, just before completing unification. Toyotomi Hideyoshi finished what Nobunaga started. A peasant's son who rose to become the ruler of all Japan, the most remarkable social ascent in Japanese history. He unified the country, launched 2 failed invasions of Korea, and died in 1598, leaving behind an infant heir. Tokugawa Ieyasu was patient. He waited. He played all sides. And in 1600, at the Battle of Sekigahara, he crushed all rivals in a single decisive day. In 1603, he became shogun. His family, the Tokugawa, would hold that title for the next 265 years. And now Japan made one of the most extraordinary decisions in human history. It chose to disappear from the world. The Tokugawa shogunate, fearing the influence of Christianity and European colonialism, enacted the policy of Sakoku, literally closed country. All European traders were expelled except a tiny Dutch trading post confined to a small island in Nagasaki harbor. Japanese citizens were forbidden from leaving the country on pain of death. Foreign ships were barred from Japanese ports. For over 200 years, Japan was sealed, the most deliberate national isolation in recorded history. Yet inside the sealed world, something extraordinary happened. Without foreign wars or outside disruptions, Japan built one of history's most stable, sophisticated societies. The Edo period, named after the new capital, modern-day Tokyo, gave Japan 250 years of near-total peace. A vibrant urban culture bloomed. The merchant class, officially ranked lowest in the Confucian social hierarchy, became rich and created popular culture. Kabuki theater packed audiences. Ukiyo-e woodblock prints celebrated beauty, nature, and daily life. Haiku poetry captured the world in 17 syllables. Sumo wrestling became a national sport. The tea ceremony became an art form. Japan turned inward and produced a culture of extraordinary depth and beauty. Samurai, with no wars to fight, became scholars, poets, and bureaucrats. The sword became symbolic, the aesthetic became paramount. But the world was changing outside Japan's walls, and in 1853 it came knocking, with cannons. On July 8, 1853, American Commodore Matthew Perry sailed 4 steam-powered warships, the Japanese called them black ships, into Edo Bay and demanded Japan open its ports to American trade. His ships were equipped with Patience shell guns, weapons that could reduce Japan's coastal defenses to rubble. Japan had no answer to them. The shogunate, which had maintained authority by keeping Japan's feudal order frozen for 2 centuries, was exposed as militarily helpless against modern Western power. Japan signed the Convention of Kanagawa in 1854. The doors were open, but the humiliation burned deep. How could Japan, a civilization of warriors and scholars, have fallen so far behind the Western world? Japan had 2 choices: accept subjugation, like China, India, and much of Asia, or transform itself so completely that the West could never threaten it again. Japan chose transformation. What followed was one of the most remarkable national reinventions in history. In 1868, young samurai reformers overthrew the Tokugawa shogunate and restored power to Emperor Meiji, then just 15 years old. This was not merely a change of government. This was Japan declaring war on its own past. The Meiji government sent missions across Europe and America to study everything. Military systems, legal codes, banking, railways, universities, factories, they returned and rebuilt Japan from the ground up. Within 30 years, Japan had a Western-style constitution, a conscript army modeled on the Prussian military, a navy trained by the British, a public education system reaching every village, telegraph lines, railways, and modern steel mills. The samurai class was abolished. Their swords became museum pieces. In 1894-95, Japan defeated China. The world was shocked. In 1904-05, Japan defeated Russia, a European great power. In the Russo-Japanese War, the world was stunned. No Asian nation had ever defeated a European power in modern warfare. Japan had performed the impossible. In 40 years, it had transformed from a feudal, isolated archipelago into a major industrial and military power. The old pattern had repeated: absorb, adapt, transform. But success carried within it the seeds of catastrophe. Japan's military victories bred arrogance. The army and navy, increasingly radical and nationalistic, began to dominate the government. Civilian politicians were assassinated. Moderate voices were silenced. Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931. It launched a full-scale war against China in 1937. Atrocities were committed, most infamously at Nanjing in 1937, where hundreds of thousands of Chinese civilians were killed. Japan joined the Axis powers with Germany and Italy. On December 7, 1941, Japan launched a surprise attack on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. In a single morning, Japan had brought the United States, with its vast industrial power, into World War II. Japan's military leaders believed the attack would keep America neutralized long enough for Japan to consolidate its empire across Asia. They were catastrophically wrong. The war turned. Island by island, American forces advanced toward Japan. By 1945, American B-29 bombers were firebombing Japanese cities, incinerating Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya. Hundreds of thousands were dying. Yet Japan's military command refused surrender. The Code of Bushido, death before dishonor, had infected an entire nation's war policy. And then came August 6, 1945, the day Japan and the entire world changed forever. At 8:15 in the morning on August 6, 1945, an American B-29 bomber named Enola Gay dropped a single bomb over the city of Hiroshima. The bomb, called Little Boy, detonated 600 meters above the city center. In a fraction of a second, a temperature equal to the surface of the sun appeared over Hiroshima. An entire city, buildings, streets, bridges, lives, was vaporized, flattened, or set ablaze in concentric circles of destruction extending miles in every direction. Between 70,000 and 80,000 people died instantly. By the end of 1945, the death toll had risen to 140,000. Those who survived, the hibakusha, carried radiation sickness, keloid scars, and psychological wounds for the rest of their lives. 3 days later, on August 9th, a second bomb, Fat Man, was dropped on Nagasaki. Another 40,000 to 80,000 people died. Japan's military government had been debating whether to fight to the last man on every island, every beach, every street. The atomic bombs broke that debate. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito addressed the nation by radio, the first time most Japanese had ever heard his voice. Japan would accept unconditional surrender. The war was over. Japan lay in ruins. Its cities were ash. Its military was dissolved. Its empire was gone. American occupation forces arrived to govern the country. By every measure of history, Japan should have taken generations to recover. What happened next defied all logic. Under American occupation, Japan was given a new constitution in 1947, one that renounced war forever. Article 9 declared that Japan would never again maintain military forces for offensive warfare. The nation that had built one of history's most formidable war machines was now constitutionally committed to peace. This was not defeat. This was transformation. Again, Japanese engineers, bureaucrats, and businessmen channeled the same ferocious energy that had built the imperial military into rebuilding the economy. American economists and quality control experts, most famously W. Edwards Deming, came to Japan to teach manufacturing efficiency. The Japanese didn't just learn, they perfected what they were taught. The concept of Kaizen, continuous improvement, became Japan's national manufacturing philosophy. Zero defects, constant refinement, no waste. Japanese factories became the most efficient in the world. By the 1960s, Japan's economy was growing at nearly 10% per year, the fastest sustained growth any large economy had ever achieved. By 1968, Japan had the second largest economy on Earth, behind only the United States. A country that had been reduced to ash in 1945 had become a global economic superpower in just 20 years. Toyota, Sony, Honda, Panasonic, Mitsubishi, these were not just companies. They were Japan's new weapons, deployed not in war, but in markets. The Minamoto won. Their leader, Yoritomo, did not march to Kyoto and demand the emperor's crown. He was cleverer than that. He left the emperor in place, a divine figurehead, and created an entirely new system of government in Kamakura, far from the old capital. He called himself shogun, supreme military commander, and just like that, Japan had two governments, the emperor in Kyoto, who held spiritual and symbolic authority, and the shogunate in Kamakura, which held actual power. This split between symbolic emperor and real military power would define Japan for the next 700 years. Toyota, Sony, Honda, Panasonic, Mitsubishi. These were not just companies, they were Japan's new weapons, deployed not in war but in markets. Japan's economic rise was powered by technology, and Japan did not merely manufacture what others invented. It innovated, relentlessly, systematically, and with a perfectionism that bordered on the obsessive. In the 1970s, Japanese companies dominated consumer electronics. Sony's Walkman, introduced in 1979, changed how humanity experienced music, a personal soundtrack for the modern world. Nintendo. By the 1980s, Japan's ambitions stretched into robotics and artificial intelligence. Honda began secretly developing a humanoid robot, Asimo, that would eventually walk, run, climb stairs, and shake hands with presidents. Japan invested in robotics, not just for industry, but because it understood something most countries hadn't yet grasped. Japan's aging population would eventually need machines to care for its elderly. Japan was solving tomorrow's problems today. But success, again, bred its own crisis. In the late 1980s, Japan's economy inflated into one of history's greatest asset bubbles. Property prices in Tokyo reached insane levels. At one point, the land under the imperial palace was theoretically worth more than all of California. Stock markets soared beyond any rational valuation. In 1990-91, the bubble burst. Land prices collapsed. Banks held mountains of bad debt. Japan entered what economists called the lost decade, which then became the lost 2 decades, and some would say 3. Unemployment rose. Youth disillusionment grew. The famously loyal salaryman culture, men who dedicated their entire lives to a single company, began to crack. Japan faced deflation, demographic decline, and a loss of the confidence that had powered its post-war miracle. And then, on March 11, 2011, disaster struck with a brutality that seemed almost cosmically designed to test Japan. A 9.0 magnitude earthquake, the most powerful ever recorded in Japan, struck off the Pacific coast. The resulting tsunami reached 40 meters high in some places, erasing entire coastal towns in minutes. Nearly 20,000 people died. The Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant, damaged by the tsunami, suffered 3 reactor meltdowns in the worst nuclear accident since Chernobyl. Japan, the only nation to have suffered atomic bombs, now faced its own nuclear crisis. Once again, Japan faced the unthinkable. Once again, Japan responded with order, discipline, and collective resilience that stunned the world. Today's Japan is a study in extraordinary contrasts. It is simultaneously the world's most ancient continuous civilization, and one of its most technologically advanced nations. Shinto shrines stand beside bullet train stations. Geisha districts exist blocks from anime studios. Ancient tea ceremonies are practiced in buildings with facial recognition doors. Japan's bullet trains, the Shinkansen, have operated since 1964 with a safety record so extraordinary that in over 60 years, not a single passenger has died in a collision or derailment. In a country regularly struck by earthquakes, this is a feat of engineering that borders on the miraculous. Japan remains the global leader in robotics, with more industrial robots per worker than any nation on Earth. It leads in precision manufacturing, material science, optics, and medical technology. Sony, Nintendo, Toyota, Honda, Canon, Fujifilm, Panasonic, Japan's brands are woven into the daily fabric of global life. Yet Japan also faces profound challenges. Its population is shrinking and aging faster than any major nation in history. By 2050, nearly 40% of Japan's population will be over 65. Immigration, which could solve the demographic crisis, remains politically and culturally contentious in one of the world's most ethnically homogeneous societies. In geopolitics, Japan navigates a complex position, maintaining its pacifist constitution while facing a rising China and a nuclear-armed North Korea, and depending on the American security umbrella. Recent years have seen Japan cautiously reinterpreting its constitution to allow greater military activity, a move that has reopened deep historical wounds with China and South Korea. Let us return to where we began. Few places in human history have faced what Japan has faced. Feudal wars lasting centuries, the complete sealing of an entire civilization from the world, the humiliation of forced opening by foreign powers, the catastrophic self-destruction of imperial militarism, the first atomic bombings in history, economic miracle followed by economic collapse, and natural disasters of world historical scale. And through every single one of these crises, Japan survived. Not merely survived, it transformed. Every catastrophe became a catalyst, every defeat became a redesign, every invasion of foreign ideas was met not with rejection, but with absorption, adaptation, and improvement. The samurai who swore to die before dishonor became the engineers who rebuilt from ash. The nation that chose total isolation became the nation that gave the world the Walkman, the bullet train, and the modern manufacturing philosophy. The country that suffered atomic annihilation became one of the world's most vocal advocates for nuclear disarmament and peaceful coexistence. Japan did not just survive everything, it learned from everything. Today, as artificial intelligence reshapes civilization, Japan is already at the frontier, developing AI systems, robots, and smart city technologies designed for the demographic and environmental challenges of the 22nd century. While others debate, Japan builds. While others fear change, Japan, the civilization that has reinvented itself more times than any other, quietly prepares for the next transformation. From the first samurai who drew his sword in service of honor, to the engineers designing robots to care for the elderly, to the survivors of Hiroshima who turned tragedy into testimony, one truth runs unbroken through 2,500 years of Japanese history. Japan does not just endure, Japan becomes. The divine wind still blows, and the story, as it has always been, is far from over. There is one final dimension of Japan's story that demands recognition, its cultural export to the world. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, Japan did not merely sell products to the world. It sold an entire aesthetic, an entire way of seeing. Anime, Japanese animated storytelling, became a global phenomenon, unlike anything produced by any other single national culture. Studio Ghibli's films, directed by Hayao Miyazaki, reached audiences in over 100 countries. Spirited Away won the Academy Award for Best Animated Feature in 2003, the first non-English language film to do so. The works of Akira Kurosawa had already transformed cinema decades earlier. George Lucas openly credited Kurosawa's The Hidden Fortress as a direct inspiration for Star Wars. Japanese food culture, sushi, ramen, tempura, omakase dining, spread to every major city on Earth, inspiring a global obsession with Japanese culinary philosophy. Respect for ingredients, mastery of technique, beauty of presentation, and the elevation of the everyday meal to an art form. Japan has more Michelin-starred restaurants than any other country. The concept of wabi-sabi, finding beauty in imperfection, impermanence, and incompleteness, quietly influenced Western design, architecture, and lifestyle philosophy. Marie Kondo's The Life-Changing Magic of Tidying Up became a global sensation, introducing millions to a distinctly Japanese relationship between space, objects, and peace of mind. Japan's fashion industry produced avant-garde designers like Yohji Yamamoto and Issey Miyake, who challenged every Western convention of what clothing could mean. Literature, Haruki Murakami became one of the world's most read novelists, translated into over 50 languages, while Kazuo Ishiguro won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 2017. A civilization that once sealed itself completely from the world had, by quiet cultural force, entered every living room on every continent. The island that chose to disappear had become impossible to ignore.